There's a better world that's a-comin', tell you why. There's a better world that's a-comin', tell you why.
I'm here to talk about the mural that was painted by Ben Shahn along with Bernarda Bryson in the school building in 1938. Ben Shahn was probably one of the, if not the most visible, prominent painters, lithographers, muralists, and so forth in the United States, roughly from the 1930s through the 1960s. And at that time, literally anybody who had the slightest idea of what was on in the art world not only knew his name, but knew something about him. He was, at the time, he was a central figure in American art. And this is probably one of his most important works. And he was commissioned to do this by, the community after the school had been built. As I'm sure most of you know, Roosevelt was built as a resettlement project, a New Deal project. The idea was to create a cooperative experiment where unemployed garment workers from New York City would be given the opportunity to come out to the countryside, live in little flat-roofed cinder block houses, work in a cooperatively owned garment factory. Some of them would till cooperatively owned fields, others would sell stuff in a cooperatively owned store. And it was a wonderful idea, and there was a huge amount of enthusiasm and excitement about it at first. And as part of it, this school building was built, and this was designed to be a school and community center. And Shahn was invited. He was part of the Federal Artists Project and came to the community to paint this mural. And as it happened, once he came here, he liked the place, and he and Bernarda ended up settling here and living here for the rest of their lives. The mural. The first thing about this is yes, it is a mural, but more specifically, it's what's known as a fresco. And that's very important because the fresco is the classic Renaissance Italian technique of doing a mural that is designed to last for hundreds of years. This is basically a retelling of three stories. The story of immigration, the story of trade unionism, and how the two kind of come together and form the underpinning for the creation of Roosevelt, or Jersey Homesteads, as it was known in those days. So we'll take this, we'll go kind of from left to right, which is a sequence that is meant to be read at. We start out with the immigration. Great. Now, here you see the immigrants coming over, from Ellis Island is shown in the lower left-hand corner, and here are the immigrants arriving. And the woman in front is Ben Shahn's mother. The man next to her left, we can all identify, it's Albert Einstein. The man to her right is an artist who was, at the time, a very famous artist in the United States, Raphael Sawyer. And a few rows behind, you can see Steinmetz. And again, part of Shahn's point was to suggest the variety of talents and genius and so forth that came to this country as immigrants. A couple of interesting things. In the upper left-hand corner, the two bodies in coffins were kind of a theme of Shahn's. Early in his career, in the 1920s, when he was still quite a young man, he was like thousands of other people on the American left, just intensely engaged in the whole episode of Sacco and Vanzetti, which was the story of two Italian immigrant anarchists who were arrested for a murder that to this day we really don't know whether or not they committed. But they were arrested and executed for the murder in a rather abrupt and questionable fashion, and it became a major cause for the American left. Shahn painted Sacco and Vanzetti time after different episodes from the story of Sacco and Vanzetti on many occasions. And that particular image of the two men in the coffin is something, two coffins, one each, is something that he had previously used in one of his Sacco and Vanzetti paintings. This was, after all, in the late 30s, and even though nobody had any reason to believe that millions of Jews would be murdered, there was still violent anti-Semitic activity going on in Germany. And it's a sign, and if you look closely, you can see there's a kind of SS man, or SA man, I'm not sure which, standing right behind it, holding it up. And it says, basically, Germans don't buy from Jews. So that's, again, that reflects, this is the continent that the immigrants came from, and it's, again, the contrast between where people came from and where they arrived. Then the image as you move along, is the Lower East Side with the tenements, and a kind of the classic image he remembered from his childhood of how on the really hot summer days, people would actually, the apartments, the tenement apartments were unbearable on hot days. Especially the early ones had virtually no ventilation, light, air, anything. And so people used to take bedrolls and go out to Tompkins Square Park and other parks on the Lower East Side and sleep outdoors. As we then sort of move along, you see the sweatshops, people working in the garment trade. So here it sort of segues into the union movement. And up, you have the building in which the Triangle Fire took place, where again, hundreds of women were packed into these fire trap buildings, working in the garment trade. The bosses locked the doors often so they couldn't slip away or leave during the day or anything. And then when the fire burst out, they had no way of escape, and over 100 women were killed in that. And that was, again, one of the sort of crucial moments in the growth of the union movement in the United States, to protest against those kind of conditions. And here you have, again, a union speaker. I'm told that Ben insisted that it was not John L. Lewis. John L. Lewis was one of the iconic union figures of the 30s. He was the founder and leader of the United Mine Workers Union. So he wouldn't necessarily have had a whole lot to do with the organizing of the garment workers in New York City. But he certainly had a very distinctive appearance. So this may or may not be John L. Lewis speaking to a crowd of people, which include the faces, recognizable faces of a number of the people in Roosevelt. One of them is Irving Plungen, who was the mayor of the village back in the 40s or 50s. Moving along, we then get, here's sort of how the trade union movement evolved. And then we see, and this is a kind of a symbolic portal for the latest Garment Workers Union, and up near the top, a course on union history, where on the blackboard you can see how the lecturer is explaining how the AFL sort of emerged from a variety of different organizations over the decades, from the mid-19th century. The person in the painting or photograph up on the wall is Samuel Gompers, who was the head originally of the Tobacco Workers Union, cigar makers, and he was the first president of the AFL. Then it sort of segues into Roosevelt. The idea is that Roosevelt, with a sort of verdant green landscape, is contrasted to the typical kind of urban development of houses right next to each other with no open space or green space. The image in the upper right-hand corner is kind of a stylized idea of sort of a symbolic idea of Roosevelt. And what any actual buildings look like. And you see the reference to the co-op, which again, this whole co-op concept was central to the idea of Roosevelt. By the way, it didn't work. The co-op farming really never worked very well, and the government sold the farms to real farmers after only a couple of years. The garment factory sort of lived on for a while, but again, by the early 40s, it went out of business. And so the co-op side of things never really got traction. But the important thing is that people, by that point, had really connected with each other and with the place. And fortunately, Roosevelt was located close enough to Trenton, Princeton, New Brunswick, Freehold, and so forth, so that even after the co-op idea kind of fizzled, people didn't have to leave in order to survive. They could stay here and find work some in the surrounding areas. So people stayed in the community, and the community survived, even though the co-op part didn't. And then, so you see FDR up there, who was certainly the key symbolic person involved here. And then finally, at the bottom, you see a bunch of people looking at the actual plan for Roosevelt. The person with his back to us is supposedly, though apparently he doesn't actually look anything like him, Alfred Kastner, who was the architect of Roosevelt. And in this undoubtedly imaginary scene, he is explaining the plan to a number of dignitaries, which are going from the top down. The first one is Haywood Brown, who is a prominent left-wing union supporter journalist of the period. Rexford Guy Tugwell, who was the head of the Resettlement Administration and a prominent kind of theorist and architect of the New Deal. Then Senator Robert Wagner, who was the author of the Wagner Act, which basically established ground rules for unionization and created the National Labor Relations Board in the 30s. The fourth person is Sidney Gilman, who was the president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. And then the last person, I don't know who he is. So the idea, again, just to sum up, you start out with immigration, coming out of the evil old world into this new world, going through the struggles of hard work and unionization, and ultimately coming to sort of the culmination of the American dream in the community of Jersey Homesteads, which is today Roosevelt.
There's a better world a-comin', and don't you know, no, no. There's a better world that's a-comin', don't you know.